Yes. So good afternoon today, everybody. It's really exciting to see all of you. I am Sean Nardell. I'm the Associate Director of Graduate Career Services in the Grad Center, which is a part of the Graduate College. Today, I am extremely excited to introduce our workshop presenter today, Dr. Erin Galyen. She is the Professor of Practice with the Office of Instruction and Assessment, as well as the co-coordinator of the Certificate in College Teaching program. Erin has a diverse background. She's got a bachelor's in physics, a master's in astronomy, another master's in English with a specialty in rhetoric, composition, and teaching of English, and a PhD in teacher education. And she is also a graduate of the Certificate in College Teaching program. So not only can she tell you about running it, she can also tell you about what it's like to be in it. She has worked with so many different people from kindergarten through adults in a variety of formal and informal roles, working on graduate level curriculum and instruction, faculty professional development, community outreach, program evaluation, as well as educational consulting. Her professional and academic interests include learner-centered education, future faculty preparation, yay, all you, writing across the curriculum, science education, and qualitative research methodologies. She has published research on inclusive pedagogy, including the effect of cultural relevancy on quantitative reasoning skills tests, and how to create learner-centered classrooms and learning experiences. And so we are delighted today to have Dr. Erin Galyen here to talk about writing, teaching, and research statements for faculty job applications. Erin, welcome.
Thank you for that amazing introduction, Sean. I will try and live up to that hype. Oh my goodness. I am so thrilled to be here with you all. Oh goodness, how many years have we been doing these workshops, and they just keep getting better and better because the participants, that's all of you, keep getting better and better. So I'm so glad that you're here. And for those of you watching the recording, we're glad that you're watching this recording or engaging with it. So thanks for being here and thanks for your interest in this topic. So yes, we are here to talk about teaching and research statements. Can you all see those slides, or can you engage with those slides? Perfect. Okay. I want to make sure my chat moved. Let me make sure I have my chat open. Great. Okay. You all still seeing that or engaging with that? Okay. All right, perfect. So the first thing I want to just say is that I'm just so glad to be here. I am at the university in spirit. I'm not here in person right this second. I'm actually working from home because we're doing a big construction project in our office. But I do want to acknowledge that we are on the traditional homelands of several Native nations, including the Tohono O'odham and the Pascua Yaqui. So I do want to acknowledge them and how that Arizona is actually home to 22 Native nations that we acknowledge. I also want to just say, please make yourself comfortable throughout this session. There will be many times, many opportunities for you to engage and interact, which you can do in the manner that you find most comfortable. So in the chat, or you can unmute your mic or send a private message to either Sean or myself if you prefer not to share your ideas with everyone. Just whatever works best for you. I want to support you in engaging in the way that works best. So let's jump right in. And there were some great questions that Sean sent to me that were included in the materials and the registration materials that you submitted when you registered for this session. So I will be answering those. And again, at any point, I will be asking for questions and questions throughout the session and our time together. But at any point, please put questions in the chat. Please unmute and ask questions. Again, this is a very interactive session. So before we move forward, any questions or comments? All right. So the first thing that I would just love to know, and you can do this by a show of hands, either physical or virtual, is how many of you are currently on the academic job market? Right, a few of you are. And you can react however you like. Yep, show of hands or thumbs up or whatever way works. Yep, great. Okay, so we have some. How about, so I'm assuming then that the rest of you are just maybe not quite on the job market, but getting ready to be on the job market. How many of you, either by show of hands, thumbs up, either in the reactions or physically, are in that state where you're exploring, you're interested, you want to learn more before you actually have to embark on the job market? All right, so it looks like we've got a bit of a split, which is great. Thank you. I appreciate that. That really helps to frame some of our conversation. That's perfect. So what we're going to do today are these three things and many more, because we might have things that you bring or questions that you have that might open up further avenues of discussion and conversation. But one of the things that we'll be doing, obviously, is to discuss characteristics of teaching and research statements as they pertain to the faculty job market or the postdoc market. It could also apply to that. You might be applying to postdocs, and many of the same materials kind of cross over, especially when it comes to these two documents. We're going to review some sample statements together, and you'll be having an opportunity to see just some different approaches to taking these two statements. There are definitely some commonalities, but there are also some stark differences. Some of those are discipline specific, and some of those are just stylistic choices based on who you are as an individual. And then the third is to brainstorm some ideas to begin writing or revising your own statements. So some of you may have already written a draft statement, and if so, hopefully you can also find what we discussed today helpful in revising your statements. I'm going to just pause here. If you have your hand raised, you might want to put it down unless you're asking a question or making a comment, because I do want to just make sure that I'm okay, great, thank you. But feel free to use that, or just, again, speak out or put comments or questions in the chat. All right, so that's kind of where we're going today. So let's just get some basics down so that we all know what we're talking about, and we're talking about the same thing. So teaching and research statements, these are typically 1 to 3 page documents. Sometimes they're a little bit more in the case of a research statement. Sometimes they're a little bit less in the teaching statement domain, but they're always about kind of this 2 to 3 page range of statement. And they're typically written. Research statements often include diagrams if you have them. If you don't, then it can be a text-only statement, but these are typically written to be short essays, essentially. And they're giving a hiring committee an idea of what you're actually going to do in the position that you're applying for relative to your teaching and your research. They're often framed in terms of your past, your present, and your future. That is, what have you done in the past? What experiences are you bringing to bear in the areas of teaching and research to the position? What work are you currently doing that you will be bringing in? And maybe what work you might be doing. So one of the questions that had come up in the pre-registration questions was, what do you do if you don't have much experience with publishing? Or what do you do if you don't have much teaching experience under your belt? That's completely fine. These statements can also be, again, prospective, future looking, and that's actually one of the advantages to having these statements be a little bit open-ended, is that they are meant to be tailored to your particular experience. Though I will say that often people don't realize how much they have done or how much they have to offer. And so one of the things that Sean and I do in our work when we're working with people on their teaching and research statements is to actually draw out those experiences and make sure that you're really representing everything that you can bring and that you've done, because it's easy to forget when you're going day to day in grad school or in your postdoc or in your current position, just how much you do and what skills and knowledge bases you bring. So that's just a little shout out for, for ways that you can get help, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So before we go on, any questions about just the basics of these two statements? All righty. Again, please ask anytime. So we're just going to look at a couple of sample job postings, partly because the names of these statements can look different. They can actually use different words, and I want to make sure that that if you don't see a particular wording for what we've talked about, that that's not off-putting or kind of freak you out a little bit. So these statements, they can sometimes be called research statements, research plans, plans of research, statement of research promise, teaching statements, teaching philosophies, teaching, really any variation. Usually they do have research or teaching in the title, but so that's really the key thing to clue into when you're looking at a job application, is where are they just using the word research, or where are they just using the word teaching, because the other framing words might be a little bit different. So here's, we're going to just look at two job posting, just the brief little snippets. Obviously the actual job postings are much longer with all the details of the positions, but this is just the list of things that they're asking you to submit. So in this case, they're being very, I would say, typical. They're saying research statement, they're saying teaching statement. So it's very clear what they're expecting, that these are kind of expected things. However, in this next job posting, which is for an assistant teaching professor position with one of the University of California schools, they're looking, so they use the word statement of teaching. This particular position is a teaching specific position. So many of you might be going for kind of traditional tenure track types of positions that have a little bit of a balance between that research, teaching, and service component. Often it's like a 40% research, 40% teaching, 20% service, though that can be negotiable depending on the position type, institution, and department and the needs that they have. But many people are applying to maybe a fully research position, maybe with some service, or a more of a teaching focused position with really no research, or maybe teaching specific research and then service. And so this is just an example of one of those other types of positions that you might find or be interested in applying for. That's the kind of position that Sean and I have. We are what the University of Arizona calls career track faculty, where our primary duties fall in the teaching and service category. And I would say that those types of positions are becoming more popular. The University of California system actually is also giving tenure for those types of positions. So not just the typical research, teaching, and service, but also teaching emphasis faculty with some service, but they are tenure track. So they're kind of leading the way. And so there's a lot of change going on in higher education relative to the types of positions that you can have. I would say that there are many, many more opportunities than there used to be. And so really, when you're on the job market, and this is what Vignesh might have been talking about last week, find a position that really looks like a good match for you, but you might do a little bit of exploring with some of this, some different kinds of positions that might have some different things to offer you. Joel is asking, how much overlap can there be between the cover letter and the statement of research or statement of teaching? That's a great question. So, it depends a little bit on what they're asking for. There are some positions that you'll see out there where they are only asking you for a cover letter and a CV and nothing else. So they're not asking for anything else. In that case, what you would do is essentially they're expecting a long cover letter, which essentially includes a lot of the elements of the teaching statement and the research statement. If they are asking for separate statements of teaching and research and some other things in addition to a cover letter, then what you would probably be expected to write is more of a short cover letter that is kind of just referencing back to your teaching statement, referencing back to your research statement. So you might just pull out some of the highlights, and it might just be maybe a paragraph that you're kind of drawing from. So those are some things maybe to keep in mind. Again, it's going to depend on what they're asking for. So reading the job application, or excuse me, the job posting for what they're asking for is really, really important. Joel, hopefully that answers your question. Maria or Mariah, does this position ask for a statement of teaching and a statement of teaching philosophy under teaching materials, and what's the difference? Great question. Yes, so the position we're looking for here, they are asking for a few different things. And as a teaching focused position, it's probably not surprising that they want to hear a lot about your teaching. So they do ask for a statement of teaching, which could include things like, as we're going to talk about in just a few moments, it could include things like, your approach to teaching. It could be examples of how you actually do your teaching, what kinds of things you do actually in the classes that you teach, or in the guest lessons that you've given, or in the way that you've mentored, folks in the lab. Those are all examples of teaching that you might have done. So that statement is typically kind of broad with maybe some careful examples. Statements of teaching philosophy sometimes are a little bit shorter and sometimes a little bit more big picture about your beliefs. I personally don't draw a distinction between those two things. I think that oftentimes, and in fact, there are almost no research studies about what hiring committees are looking for properly. So, if they are asking for multiples, what you might do in that circumstance is actually just reach out to the contact on the job posting and say, I noticed that you're asking for both this and this. Can you tell me a little bit more about what you're looking for in both of those or either of those? And that way, that can actually help to make sure that you're actually giving the committee what they're asking for. Because again, the committee is going to have some idea of what they're looking for. That may not be very explicit in the job posting. So that's a great question. Mohammed, question in the chat: Is that okay to write both in one document as per the employer requirement? They ask for a research and teaching statement. Yes. So again, you want to adhere as closely as you can to the job posting and what they're asking for. But again, different positions, different institution types, different departments are going to ask for slightly different things. And so if you're confused, perfectly okay to just reach out to that contact and just clarify. I wouldn't send them like 10 emails, but ask 1 to 2 emails. Just making sure that you're understanding what they're asking for is very, very reasonable to do, because you do want to make the best use of their time and your time in that process. Great questions. Any other questions for now? Oh, let's see. Hikao, yes. How many pages should there be if they ask for effectiveness, evidence of teaching effectiveness? Great question. So I want to just do a little bit of defining of that term first. So evidence of teaching effectiveness, as the name implies, they're asking you for something that shows the quality of your teaching, something that shows that you are effective in your teaching. That can actually be a lot of different things. Since we're here, I'm going to skip ahead and then we can talk about it now, and then we'll come back to the specific examples, because it does definitely come into play here. So I'm going to just skip just a few slides down. These are great questions. Keep them coming. So sometimes institutions, especially if you're applying to a job that's a very teaching focused position, they will ask for a separate statement of teaching philosophy or statement of teaching or teaching statement. Again, I'm using all those in the same vein, and a separate statement of teaching effectiveness. So the difference between them is that one is more about painting a picture of what you do, and the other one is telling them how effective what you do is for students, for their learning, for their sense of belonging, for other types of metrics. Sometimes they will ask for you to actually just send them teacher course evaluations in a PDF, and they're not asking for a statement that maybe is more of a synthesis. And that's, I would say, the biggest difference is that the statement is typically a synthesis. So it might include tables that show trends, for example, or a table that shows, your progress of over time in your ratings, in the ratings that students have given you. It might include things like departmental common exam results, how your students in your sections have performed against other students in other sections. Not everybody has that. In fact, that's pretty rare, but it's on here just in case that's useful. Both of those, that's a direct measure of student learning. The first is more of a student perception about their experience in the class. The third one might be a statement or maybe quotations from either students or supervisors or others who have observed your teaching. So-and-so has been was a great guest lecturer in my class. They really engaged the students in discussion on these topics. I really felt like the students learned a lot, and students reported that, that they really understood the concepts better after, after this person gave their lesson, for example. And of course, reflection on learning. So those might be also kind of quotations from student artifacts on learning. So, I would say the gold standard is anything that you can do to tie or demonstrate student learning of your classes. That's kind of the gold standard showing, of what your effectiveness is. But not all of us have that opportunity to teach our own classes, or maybe even to teach at all in a class setting. So, quotations from surveys. You can also give your own survey. If you're guest teaching, you could, for example, ask the instructor of record for the class to submit a survey to the students on your behalf that might have some of those information, kind of some of those metrics. In fact, there's nothing to say that you couldn't just take the questions from the university official course evaluations, make your own survey, and have it administered or administer it. So you can use all the tools at your disposal. And that would be kind of an example of a survey of students that you've done. Informal feedback, again, that might be an email that you received or a quote from an email. There might be other evidence that you might want to include. The one thing that I'll just say is if you are including student work or quotations, unless you have specific permission from that person to use their name or other identifying information, the best rule of thumb is to make sure that it's just anonymous. So just, pull off the name, or maybe just say student, or sophomore student from, this class, the name and the or the prefix and the number, sociology, 202 or, whatever. Keating is asking, can you give examples of the kinds of writing samples they may be looking for? Absolutely. We're going to look at some examples in just a minute here. Sarah is asking, if they do not specify the page limits, what would be the most reasonable pages for research and teaching statements? Great questions. So I would say that research statements tend to be a bit longer because they do probably want a bit more detail. So those are typically, I would say, 2 to 5 pages. They're not much longer than that typically, especially if you include things like images, diagrams, tables, schematics that you've created. They tend to be a little bit longer because that's going to make sure, kind of shift the text around. So they may be a little bit longer, but I wouldn't go much longer than that. Teaching statements are typically 1 to 2 pages in length. Typically, if it's a statement of teaching effectiveness, where again, you're including diagrams, tables, quotations, that might be a bit longer. That might be a little bit more on the, 3 page or so. But again, it depends on what they're asking for. If they honestly are saying, include all your teacher course evaluations, you might be sending them, a 25 or 50 page PDF with all those student ratings and all the quotations. Let's see, Mohammed, yes. Okay, difference between a research statement and a research program. Great questions. Okay, so let's go back and just look at what these statements are and kind of what they contain. And then we'll look at some examples. And again, keep these questions coming. They're great. So a research statement, again, typically 3 to 5 pages that it offers specifics about your independent research program. This might include things like funding, collaborations, other support structures. So the key here is independent research program. What you want to do is to prove that from day one in this position, you will be working on and contributing to research in your chosen field of study. So that means that you know, for example, how to write research questions, how to build a methodology, how to conduct an analysis, how to interpret your findings, tie it, how to do a lit review, how to potentially find funding depending on the type of position you're looking into and depending on the type of work that you're doing. So, not everyone is going to come in necessarily with funding or with plans for funding immediately, but I would say that at least knowing which grants to apply for, that is something that will also go into that statement. Again, you'll see those examples in what we look at in just a few minutes. A couple other things you want to show. You want to show that you are independent, but often that you can collaborate well. So it's kind of a little bit of a balance. So how do you do that? Well, you can talk about all the skills you have and all the methodologies that you know. You can talk about typically the way that these are structured is maybe by theme. So often there are maybe 2 or 3 themes that people say of research they're doing. These might be questions that they're trying to answer or big topics they're addressing. So kind of 3 essentially 3 different research ideas is kind of maybe the basic idea. And what you're essentially writing there is kind of an abstract. So it's often in the form of an abstract where you're essentially summarizing the work that you've done. And it could be something similar to what you might write in a paper. It's kind of almost like a publication quality summary there. And then the other thing that another big thing that they will want to see is how you're situating your research in a larger context. So why is it important? Who cares? Why is it significant for your discipline, for the world, for a particular population, for some aspect of the context that you're working with? That how you frame that, which is usually done at the very beginning of the research statement, not always, but often, that is something that all grant applicants have to do in their grants. And so in part, they're asking you if you know your field well enough, because there's a lot of subtext written into all of these documents. You're not just talking directly about what it is you've done, but you're also demonstrating in how you're doing it, the way that you work and your qualifications. So for example, how you talk about your plans for your research or what research you've done is also identifying and communicating your skills in written communication, for example, how you would frame the importance of your work to grant funders when you're applying for grants, whether you know your field well enough to know who the prominent researchers and discussions and frameworks are. All of those things are actually kind of subtext in what you're actually writing about very explicitly in both this and the teaching statement. So that's very important. I'm going to continue with this. There was a question that came up. I will address that in just a moment when we get to the teaching statement section. So hang on just a moment. The next thing that you'll be asked to do is again, and this is all implicit, right? They're not actually saying in your teaching statement or in your research statement, address these things. They're just going to say, like we looked at those job postings, statement of research or teach or research statement. That's all the information they will typically give you, and then the duties of the job. And so the other thing that you want to be able to do is, to the extent that you can, have your research statement address some of those job duties. Whether that's something that maybe addresses, a need that they're saying, we need a person in this field and in this subfield doing this kind of research. Then in your research statement, you can actually tailor what you're saying and how you're saying it to really show that you can actually do that. So those are just a couple, again, it's part of that subtext that's written in. So demonstrating how you would add to the department in terms of your research, your subfield, your funding, that's where the rest of the job posting comes into play. And so you want to read those very, very carefully. And again, Sean or I or anyone else who's involved in this particular series can help you with that kind of deciphering of some of that coded language sometimes that is used. And then you can speak to that directly in your statements. Describes how you work productively. So here again, you're showing in what you've done, what you will be able to do in the position. And so, or what you plan to do. So, it's not to say that you have to say, I wake up every day at 7:15 and then I, check my email. And hopefully you don't actually do that. And this is what my day looks like. It's not something that looks like that, but it's more about, showing things like, oh, and I published in these journals, and here are some citations. It's not uncommon actually to have people include some of their first author citations in their research statement. Yes, it's in your CV as well, but it's just to highlight, especially things that might be very unique about the work that you did. It can be very important to highlight. So, that's one way. Another way, I've developed these research collaborations with these scholars in the field. So the fact that you're talking about how you've cultivated your own, your own collaborations, or maybe you've built a connection with a research site that maybe is new, or that you've developed a type of analysis or methodology. All of those kinds of things show not only that you can do independent work, but that you work productively. So let me go back to the chat. There's been a few things that have come up here. I'm going to grab a sip of water. Just give me a moment, please. Okay, so again, I'm going to wait on the teaching statement since we'll get there next, but just addressing the the research statement just for now. Theodora is asking, is the research statement refined for each job and department or tailored? I would say that overall, to the extent that you can, yes. I will tell you, and again, for those of you who are already on the job market, you know this, being on the job market is kind of like having another part-time job. It is very time consuming, and partly because these statements do take a lot of time. These materials do take a lot of time to put together, to go through revision processes, to have them vetted by colleagues or advisors or, other folks that you want to have eyes on them. So, ideally, yes, but in reality, what you might do is spend, you can prioritize. You don't have to spend the same amount of time on every single application, especially if there's some that you're really, really excited about. So prioritize those, put in most of your time on those, and then the others might, be sent maybe something a little bit more generic, or something that is maybe similar or the same as what you sent to another institution that you were maybe more excited about. So, again, only you know how much time you have. So that's, but that's one approach that you can take. Any other questions for now about just the basics of the research statement? I think I covered everything that was in the questions that were in the chat, but anything else? Jasmine is asking, how do you recommend addressing future plans for research? Great. So, this can either come in into the statement as just one of your maybe 2 to 3 sections that summarize the research that you have done or that you would like to do. Or it might be in a separate section that's kind of subtitled, future work or future directions. So that's a little bit of a stylistic choice. Sometimes, especially with postdoc positions, they actually do sometimes ask you specifically, what are your future research plans? In which case you want to make it very, very clear in like a separate section what that means. Yes, so I think hopefully that question was answered. So yes, either integrated or as a separate section. And again, that's something that you might also talk about potentially in your CV, though I would say future work you might want to focus in more of the research statement rather than in the CV, because the CV you almost want to say this is more like what I already have done. But again, if it's a position that didn't ask you for a separate research statement, then you have to kind of put some of that into the into that extended cover letter. Yeah. Highlighting promise, same thing. You can integrate it in lots of different ways. And I would say that if you're wanting to know more about how to do this for your specific case, come meet with us. Meet with Sean, meet with me, meet with your your advisor, your chairs, your other instructors or colleagues in your discipline. Just gather that input from others about how you can, who know you or who you will share your work with, who can give you some specifics, because everybody's very, very individual. Sarah is asking, so it seems that research statement needs to show both your previous work and work you would like to do in the future. What would be the ideal proportion for each? That's a great question. So I would say that you want to show primarily what you've already done, because again, the number one purpose of the research statement is to show that you can do independent research. So, it could be that you've spent, most of your time doing your research for your dissertation, but sometimes what you can do is pull out different sections of that work. And so, again, it can help to talk with someone who can help you parse out that information and communicate it effectively. So I would say, maybe 2/3 to 1/3. Sean, I'm looking at you. I'm wondering if you want to contribute to that question as well, because because of your tremendous expertise.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good ratio. Bottom line is, what are you going to do in their department for the next 3 to 5 years to bring prominence and prestige to their department? So how can you demonstrate that once you get there, you've got things you can do? So if you're a STEM person and you're leaving a lab, what can you take with you? There might be some that, they may be concerned that everything you've been working on, you can't take with you. You've got to leave in the lab you're in. What can you take with you? It might be there's a line of something, a germline you can take with you, and I've got these cells and I'm going to be able to do yada, yada, yada with them. So they just really want to know, do you have an idea what you're going to do here? Because all of a sudden you basically have to start from scratch in many cases. And so they want to know, can you do that?
Thank you so much, Sean. Theodora asking, where do publications for lay media, Scientific American, etc., fit into the application? Great question. Your CV, first of all, I would say first and foremost is the place for that. But if it's very relevant to your research, you might potentially talk about it in the research statement. For example, there might be a section where you talk about publications or outreach related to your research, and maybe like a short paragraph or listing. And that's something that you could also highlight there. I have shared my research in these professional circles, but also in these, kind of more general public circles. And that the same goes for, blog postings, podcasts, anything you might have written for like a departmental newsletter, e-newsletter. So, it doesn't have to go out to the entire world, like in a big prominent publication. For those kinds of things, all the student showcase, the GPSC every year has a student showcase. Those are things to also include on your CV. So, to show that you've presented your work to different audiences. Outreach in general, public talks, community involvement, same place, CV, and then you might talk about it briefly in that research statement. So it all goes here. There is no outreach statement. Correct. Yeah, typically there's not a separate outreach statement. That might go into your teaching statement though, depending on what it is or the nature of it as well. So, there may be a little bit of crossover there. Again, it just depends if you think it applies more to your research versus what you can show for your teaching.
Yeah, and I'll just say, think about relevance. So if your outreach is really relevant, if something you do is extremely relevant outreach-wise to your research, then it's going to make sense to be in there. And next week, Dr. Masha Galyen is going to talk about diversity statements, and it might be something that goes in there, but definitely keep track of all those things and make sure they're on your CV.
Thank you so much, Sean. See, we're a good team. We're a good team here. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the teaching statement, then we'll get back to some of those questions that were previously asked, and then we're going to look at some examples. So a teaching statement, similar to a research statement, is also, kind of an exhibition, a demonstration of what you can do as kind of as an independent instructor, just like the research statement is showing what you can do as an independent researcher. And it typically involves, like, the overarching theme of it is offering some specifics about evidence-based teaching practice. So not many people actually get formal education in teaching and evidence-based teaching practice, right? I mean, that's just the facts. So how do you learn about those sorts of things? Well, there are many programs that I'll point you to later that can help with that. But the one thing that you might just want to keep in mind is that the focus of teaching is to help students learn. I know that sounds silly, but it actually it is a little bit of a shift. The purpose of teaching is to help students learn, and so what you can do in your teaching statement is really focus on the things that you have done or do or could do to help students learn. Just even within your own experience, a lot of people will start their teaching statements with, when I was an undergrad. That's a perfectly acceptable way to start a teaching statement. I had this experience. I found, personalized, approaches to learning really helpful. Or, my advisor took me under their wing and really helped me to understand this. Or I had this great mentor, or we went on this field trip, or I had this, research experience that was associated with the class. So, it is perfectly okay. And in fact, it's almost expected that, that the teaching statement will be written in the first person. And so this is one thing that's a little bit different than some of the other potential statements that might be in your application materials. So research statement could be written in the third person. It could be written with some first person as well. The cover letter, obviously, it's a letter to an individual or a committee, so you want to address them. It's written in the third person, or you, or even second person. But the teaching statement in particular, as well as the diversity, equity, and inclusion statement that Masha is going to talk about next week, are pretty much exclusively written in the first person. So that's just something to keep in mind. So it's perfectly okay to say I. In my class, I do this. In my guest lecturing, I have done this. in my mentoring of undergraduates, I do this, or I could do this. And then again, use your resources. If you, chances are you are already using evidence-based teaching practices, even if you don't necessarily know that they are. But anything that involves students actively in the classroom through discussions, through problem solving, anything like that is, that's all good experience there. Is student-centered and attuned to diverse learning needs. So this will overlap with your diversity, equity, and inclusion statement if you need to submit one, because this is where you can potentially talk about how you tailor things for students' needs. Again, if you don't know what that means, that's okay. You'll see it in some of the examples. And there are people like Sean and I and others on campus that can help you with some of that, just some of that. Demonstrates reflectiveness. So, this is one of those characteristics of teaching that that essentially shows that that teaching is a knowledge base and a skill set that you continue to develop, just like your research. And so it might be things, you might talk about things like professional development around teaching that you might have engaged with. I went to this webinar, or I'm engaged in this certificate program, or I learned about teaching in this, in this class in our department. And so, those are all ways to just show that you know that you want to continue to learn about teaching, that that it's a body of knowledge and a skill set that you can continue to develop and continue to learn about. Or, I always, really attend to the course evaluations and the feedback that students give me. I ask my students for feedback 3 times during the class, and I make changes at at every point. Just those are just some examples of what you might include. And if the things that I'm sharing, the examples that I'm sharing, are not things that you've done, that's okay. Again, come get some support, and we can help you tailor your materials to what you have done. It probably goes without saying, but a teaching statement should also convey a value for teaching. So it doesn't matter if if you maybe don't want to do as much of the teaching as you want to do research. That's perfectly fine. But if you're going to be in a position or applying for a position that has any teaching, you should value teaching. Just like if you're going to be applying for a position that involves research, you should value research. Kind of same thing. So let me go back to some of the questions that were asked previously. So there was a direct question. For teaching statement, applicants always mention some potential course he or she could teach in the department. However, if I'm more experienced in some courses which are not open in that department, would it be good for us to mention that we can help develop a new course, or we should be safe only to mention the existing courses? Great question. So sometimes they will ask you for a list of courses you could teach, and usually that's where you have to do your homework and go to the departmental website or the institution website and kind of do a little bit of digging about what courses they offer. And you could say, I could offer this course by name, this course by name, this course by name, or based on my area of expertise, I would love to develop a course on this or this. You don't always have to mention it, especially if you're writing more of a short teaching statement or teaching philosophy. You may not mention that, but it could be something you might mention in your cover letter, for example, because you're going to be talking more about the job duties a little bit more specifically in that document. So you might do that there instead of the teaching statement. But again, you have to see what they're asking for. Hopefully that answers that question. Again, if you have,
sorry.
Go ahead, Sean, please.
You can also put a list of your graduate coursework in your CV. I have seen weird faculty meetings where faculty have looked at, they took a course in this. They could teach a course in this. No one's taught a department's course in this in X number of years. Let's just bring them in because they could maybe teach a course in this. So even if you don't talk about it, it's just another way of sometimes letting people know that you have expertise in certain things.
Thank you so much for adding that. Okay, I'm just again going through the chat, making sure that if I've missed something, feel free to submit your question again because I'm trying to scroll, but I might have missed something. So let's see. Thea is asking, are all kinds of quotes paraphrasing external sources in research and teaching statements a big no, as I have heard from many? From external sources, can you share a little bit more about what you mean by that? Do you mean like from students, or do you mean like quoting other like books or articles? There, if you just want published scholarship, you typically do want to focus on what you have done, but you know, if there's somebody that's very influential, you know, I have seen people put particularly their teaching statements, not so much in their research, but in their teaching statements, they might say, "I've been very much influenced by, you know, these particular scholars or educators in you know this field." And you might list them, or you might say this quotation from this scholar, you know, really guides my thinking about, you know, about active learning or assessing learning. So it might be something like that. That would be okay, but I would say very sparse. I would say maybe not more than one or two times. And again, I wouldn't do it in a research statement necessarily, but in a teaching statement, it could be okay. We are seeing that more people are including citations in their teaching statements where they're saying, you know, making claims about or to get, or, you know, to show that they're, that what they're putting forth for their teaching approach is evidence-based. So they might, for example, cite a National Academies book, like How People Learn, or they might, you know, there might be a disciplinary article that talks about, you know, best practices in their field for teaching. So that could be something that you could include a quote from, or a footnote, you know, to just show, or in a citation, an endnote, to show that yes, you're reading, you know, you're reading in your field, and you, you know, that you know where to find sources. Again, it's not expected, but we're seeing it more and more. Sarah asks, would teaching experiences other than at college university settings, for example, leading workshops for practitioners, be considered as teaching experiences as well? Yes, yes, and yes. Great question. So yes, any kind of anything, professional development. You know, you taught a workshop about, you know, R, for example, to your, you know, to your colleagues. You right, leading workshops for practitioners. All of that is great experience and absolutely applies to your teaching. Yeah. Theodora, do traditional tenure track positions offer the opportunity to craft their own course? Over the span of your career, absolutely. Maybe not immediately. It depends on the needs of the department, but it might be that they're really excited about something that is very specific to you, and they want you out of the gate to basically develop a course on that topic. Or if you've already developed a course on that topic and you're just bringing it in, you know, that could also be something to also share, is if you've developed your own courses, or again, that's all. So it's not just if you've taught, but also if you've developed any kind of instructional or curricular materials. Those are also really good things to include. Okay, so let's look at a few examples. So what I'm going to do is actually just keep on share on screen share, and then I'll put the link in the chat, just so that way those who are watching the recording know what we're looking at. So these have actually changed a little bit in the order. So we're going to start with, this is a pseudonym, but these are actual materials. They come from University of California at San Francisco. So Chuck Norris is a pseudonym. So what we're going to do is actually skip down to so this is the cover letter. It actually includes their entire packet, which is part of why I chose these materials. And you'll have the links to these and the slides, that afterward. So we're going to just click down. So Chuck Norris is applying for a more of a teaching focused position, like at a liberal arts type of school or a comprehensive university. So, different institution types, as you might have heard from Vignesh last week, are going to have a slightly different focus, though, again, things are changing and you can be at a research institution and have a teaching focused position like Sean and I do. So it really just depends. But I will say, for the purpose of this conversation, that Chuck Norris is applying for a little bit more of a teaching focused position. So what I'll just highlight for you, let me just leave this up, and meanwhile I will put the link to the actual material in the chat for you. So give me just a moment. Okay, so that's a long it's a long URL because it's a link to a PDF, so it'll open a PDF, and if you prefer not to do that, then again, it's here. My apologies, it just clicked over to that other statement. I knew it was going to mess that up. So what I'll just point out to you, a couple things, since the teaching statement is here first, we'll just look at the teaching statement first for Chuck Norris. And so what you'll see is the first thing just to notice, just as we scroll, is the structure. So in this case, long paragraphs with some big kind of big statements that kind of give the topic statement for that paragraph. And you can see that they're written to be like statements of approach. So teach students to think like scientists. That is, that's one of the main things here. All teaching statements do not have to look like this. Again, sometimes people will just have paragraphs that are a little bit more flowing or in more of a narrative style. This is just a stylistic choice that this individual chose to include, more of this, a little bit more like subheadings, more like abstracts, like mini abstracts kind of style. I take the same rigorous evidence-based approach I use with my research and apply it to my teaching. And so then what you do, so you might have kind of a big statement like that. And then the key is to actually to look at some examples, to give the committee some examples of what you actually do in that actually demonstrate that. So in this case, so the demonstration of this big idea of I take the same rigorous evidence-based approach I use with my research and apply it to my teaching. So to that, this individual says, exams will be designed to assess whether students have achieved my learning outcomes. So that's a very concrete kind of thing that this individual would do. However, even in a class with several midterm exams in addition to a final, that creates only a handful of opportunities to receive quantitative information about the class's performing. To better monitor student learning, I will use formative assessment, which is the use of a formal and informal methods to gather data on how students are learning during a course and modify the teaching strategy accordingly. So you notice that in this example, Chuck Norris is speaking prospectively, using will. I will use formative assessment. So clearly this isn't something that they have necessarily done themselves, but they're able to give very concrete, specific examples. And then here is just a kind of a summary statement. At State, I would be prepared to teach Introduction to Biological Chemistry, as well as Introductory Biology and advanced electives such as Molecular Biology and Advanced Cell Biology. Additionally, I would be excited to participate in state's tutorial course, given that close interaction with students is a major reason I am pursuing faculty positions exclusively at liberal arts colleges. So again, there's that tailoring that we talked about before. Just little subtle little hints. It doesn't have to be big statements. Okay, so let's look at Chuck Norris's research statement. Okay, so starting out, also kind of big picture, investigating the structure and function of calcium channels, and then starting with some big questions. How do calcium channels pass their substrates across a biological membrane? What hypotheses about an ion channel's transport mechanism can we make and test based on structural data, et cetera, et cetera? These are fundamental questions that undergraduates in my lab at State will address. So here, they're being very strategic because they're not only saying that this is my research plan, but they also know that undergraduate research is very important. And so they're saying, these are the types of things that undergraduates in my lab are going to be studying. So sharing with the committee that they already have a plan for involving undergraduate students in research because they know that's a priority of that institution. So these little subtle things that you can write in. Theodora, question, it seems these statements are very dry. Is there a way to insert one's own personality into these writing pieces without seeming unprofessional? Absolutely. And this is much more of maybe a disciplinary kind of difference as well. These two examples that we're just going to look at just quickly are more coming from STEM fields. And so they're expected to maybe be a bit more concise, a bit more sparse in the language. Whereas if you're in, something like the humanities, fine arts, even social sciences, it might be more of a narrative style, and it might be a little bit more personal. Oh, you are in STEM, Theodora. Then, I would say that the place to do that. Thank you for your comments. I would say that the teaching statement and the diversity and equity and inclusion statement are a little bit more of those, personal type statements that can be a little bit less dry and more narrative style. So again, I'm showing you ones that are a little bit more kind of analytical, but that doesn't mean that they have to be. The research statement probably does need to be a little bit more in that publication style of your discipline. But again, teaching and DEI statement are going to be a little bit more tailored to your own personal style, I'll say, if that helps. Sarah writes, I'm in the later years of my PhD program. When is the best time to create a research teaching statement? Anytime. If you're a first year, you can write one, really, and then revise it over time. So, if you're starting now, great. Start now. Even if you're not on the job market yet, it can be a good time to even just start it. And actually, we're going to look at one more quick example. And then you're actually doing a little bit of brainstorming in the few minutes that we have left. So I do want to just say also, again, my lab will investigate big picture, and we'll teach them essential biochemistry methods. So again, combining those two things together, very, very smart. Summary of proposed research. So essentially, you have 3 projects. Determine whether I'm not going to try and pronounce that word because I don't know it. So anyway, it will be in the examples that you can access. Oligomerization, and if anybody knows that word, my apologies for probably not doing it the right pronunciation, is necessary for transport by calcide transporters. Yes, these examples will be shared with you. And then there's a little bit of an abstract. And so there are 3 of those, project 1, project 2, project 3. And you'll see also my previous work, I have developed a curious result can happen. I propose, so here this person literally used that 2/3 past, 1/3 future kind of thing. These two things are what I've done. The first one is a little bit more about the topic, and more sort of more of the microbiology. The second one is more about the methodology. I have developed a yeast genetic complementation assay. It's more of a technique. And then the third one, this is a curious result. I'd like to learn more about that. And this is how my lab's going to do it. And then they have a little bit of an introduction. I'm going to scroll a little bit. So if this is too fast, just close your eyes. Okay, we're back. So there are some placeholders here for figures. So this is to protect the anonymity of the person. That's why they have just figure 1 here. In the actual statement, they would actually have the figure in the statement. And then there's a little caption about the structure and mechanism of ABC in this case. And then they go into a little bit more detail about the projects that they're going to do. So again, we're just going to scroll through. They give a little bit more detail. And then towards the end, they specifically, again, knowing that undergraduate research is important to the position they're applying for, they have an entire paragraph about undergraduate research considerations. I would say, so they didn't really talk about grants here because they know that maybe that's not as appropriate for for this type of institution. And then they have some references. However, for the other example, that's Marty McFly, again, pseudonym. I do want to just point out to you, I'm going to scroll down. They have kind of a similar type of structure to this research statement. They kind of subdivided a little bit more. This is a longer one and includes space for figures, which you'll see. Thank you, Sean, for the time check. Yep, we're just going to look at these and then move on. And let me put a link in the chat. I think it's this one. I actually didn't make these pseudonyms up. They were provided by the source material that is out there on the web. So I think this should be the right link here. Okay, so again, the structure of this is a little bit different. You're seeing there's a lot more bold for certain text that they want to really make sure that the readers highlight. And again, this person chose to organize more by aims, and then break down almost like a mini research paper kind of format where they're talking about the aim, the design, the data analysis, interpretation, and the impact. And so that's another choice. Instead of kind of the one that we explored previously. Here we go. An entire paragraph devoted to collaboration. I will lead a multidisciplinary research group with a focus on quantitative biology approaches, etc. For example, my lab could work closely with those of, and then they listed, here they just say name, 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 but in the actual application, they actually listed people's names. And so that's, that's the way that they did that. They also have a separate paragraph for funding. I will seek support for diverse tissue engineering, disease A, and developmental biology research programs via government organizations, including the NSF. And then they list the exact sub, like either the kind of the codes for the grant, or the subfields that they know that their readers will know. NSF BioMC and ENG CBET, NIH, NCI, NIBIB, NICHD, etc. Relevant study sections include, and then they show that because it's showing that they know what they're talking about. And then they also throw in some private foundations, including the Burroughs Wellcome Fund and nonprofit organizations such as the March of Dimes, etc. And then you see there are references as well there. So those are just a couple of examples. And again, you will receive those. Okay, So what we're going to do just in 1 or 2 minutes, you're just going to get going on this. And in the meantime, I will respond in the chat to some folks that had written. So what I'd like you to do just in on paper or record yourself sharing, like an audio recording or typing things out. We're just going to take 1 minute for you to do these. This is just to get started. You will do this in much more detail when you actually write these statements, but it's just to get started. So we're just going to do a minute for the research statement to get started and a minute for the teaching statement. And I will stop talking and let you do that. So 1 minute for the research statement. List of keywords or phrases that characterize your current research. List of keywords or phrases that characterize your research goals, or make a list of keywords that will characterize how you will achieve your research goals. So just pick one of these and just brainstorm for 1 minute. Okay, so even if you just wrote down a few words, that's okay. And then we're going to do the same thing for the teaching statement. So you might choose to make a list of keywords or phrases that characterize your major goals of teaching. This could be in your discipline or in general, or that characterize how you could or how you do teach in your current or future courses, or how you would know that students have reached these goals. So just, again, take about just a minute and brainstorm on one of these prompts. We are at time. Hopefully that just helped you just get a quick start to your process. Where to learn more? Again, you're going to have the link to these slides. I'm going to also send you in the slides. There's going to be a link to the resources, to a whole separate resource sheet with lots of examples. You can also reach out to Sean at the Grad Center or to me. Here is my email address. And where else to get help with your statements? Your own departments, your colleagues, instructors, your committee, the think tank writing center, the writing skills improvement program. This workshop will have a place where you can actually get help with your own statements. So I would say we're out of time, so I'm going to just pause there. Thank you all so much for being here, and reach out. Really, we're here to help. To Sean, to me, to your resources. We want to help you get to where you want to go. And with that, I'll just wish you all the best in your writing, and hope to see you at a future event. And yes, the slides will be shared.
Thank you so much, Erin. This has just been, as always, I learn things, so thank you very much. I'm going to stop